to free your captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear.
Well, welcome and thanks for joining us. We are in week 2 of a series called Christmas According to Matthew. We're looking at passages from the Christmas story in the Gospel of Matthew and making a connection to the images of salvation as presented through the Exodus, the exile, and the sacrifices, which Pastor Brian spoke about in our November series. If you missed last week, find it in our archives to hear the entire introduction to this series. Last week, we talked about how an exodus involves a vision, a move, and an acknowledgement of the presence of God. And we made a connection regarding the Israelites making an escape or an exodus from Pharaoh to the Promised Land, which paralleled Jesus and his family making an escape from Herod, who was trying to destroy Jesus. The culmination of our Exodus talk would best be represented by thinking of a person moving from one place in life to a better place that involves, in this case, the presence of God. Well, today we will talk about being in exile. When we think of an exodus, we immediately think about a move. And in exile, thoughts can quickly turn to images of waiting, stagnating, and even tediousness of getting through details along the way. Think about the times that you have moved in your life, or maybe times when you have helped other people through the moving process. In most cases, if you were packing boxes, loading up a truck, and uprooting from one place, you would know where you would be unloading the truck on the other side of it all. However, imagine moving from a place where you were somewhat settled and having to wander and wait for some time, not clearly knowing where you may end up until the final destination is reached. Kind of sounds like everyday life for some reason, right? Well, one simple definition of exile is displacement. Another is a period of voluntary removal from one's home. In the Old Testament, the Israelites experienced exile when they migrated out of their homeland and they looked to settle in various parts of the world. It goes deeper, though, than a geographical or physical displacement. In the Bible, or the spiritual realm, exile is a human condition. It represents a feeling of alienation and longing for something more. Pastor Brian, in our November series, summarized it like this.
For almost 50 years, the people of Judah were exiles in a foreign land, the land of Babylon. Their lives and plans had been radically disrupted and disordered. Through circumstances beyond their control, they found themselves away from their home. And home was more than just a physical place where they grew up. Home was a trajectory, a plan, an assumption or expectation about how life should work and would work. Life was supposed to be up and to the right, to use our graph image from last week. But now, from 586 to 539 BCE, the plan, the path, the graph was disrupted and disordered. Defeat, depression, disillusionment. In a word, exile.
Pastor Brian goes on to share an idea from Richard Rohr, who talks about order, disorder, and reorder. And within disorder, there is often exile, and it will yield to God's reorder. But exile always ends. Like when you finally get that last box unpacked from your move, and you feel like you are home again. There's a unique exile that we'll look at today, and it comes in the form of the story of the Magi following the star that will lead them to Jesus. Again, this story is only found in the Gospel of Matthew. No other gospel has it, and no other gospel mentions the star. Let's read from Matthew chapter 2, verses 9 through 12. Now remember from last week, the Magi first encountered King Herod, who wanted to destroy Jesus. This passage begins immediately after Herod asks them to report back to him with the location of Jesus. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Who were these three people, and where did they come from? Both good questions with not very clear answers, since little is known about these kings. In fact, we don't really even know if they were kings. That's a title ascribed to them because of their wealth. Their place of origin is also not clear either, though scholars have thought probably Babylon. And their names were assigned sometime after the writing of the scriptures, several hundred years in fact. They were given names Melchior, Gaspar, and Balthasar. An additional point about them is that they were most likely ancient astronomers. That would explain their interest in the star and their ability to track it properly. It is believed that they traveled 800 to 900 miles from the east to meet Jesus. Our tech director, Rob Halford, he's from Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis is about 830 miles away from here, and Rob says it takes about 13 hours to travel one way from here to there in a car. That is about the distance that the Magi traveled to get to Bethlehem, not in a car. Can you imagine that? What would have moved them to make such a journey? This would have taken several months, even years. In fact, it is thought that they met with Herod the day after Jesus was born, and they did not meet Jesus until he was a toddler. That is how long they were traveling. They were away from their home, in search of a king. They were in exile. Just as the Israelites searched for the promised land, the three wise men searched for the promised one, the Messiah, Jesus. We said last week that in the case of the Exodus, there were some big supernatural elements involved. The great supernatural element in today's story would have to be the star. In verse 9, we are told that the Magi began following the star when it rose, then it literally stopped where Jesus was. So what was the deal with this star? Scientists have tried to identify what it actually was, and it has been called many things. A merging of planets, a comet, a scientific phenomenon. Some have point blank said it's just a miracle. There's no other explanation. I like the perspective of biblical scholar Colin Nicole, who calls the Star of Bethlehem the greatest comet in history. He made these intriguing observations about it. The star was like comet Hale-Bopp. In 1996 and 97, Hale-Bopp was seen by people all over the world. Hale-Bopp was the longest of any comet in the scientific period and was visible for 18 months. The Star of Bethlehem also had to be huge. We know that the three men followed the comet for a year or longer. The wise men followed the star, which was supplied as a guide by God. In a strong parallel to the Old Testament, Exodus 13:21, when Israelites were being led through their exile, we read this: "By the day the Lord went ahead of them with a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so they could travel by day or night. The wise men had a purpose and goal. They looked for the star to guide them in exile, in a time of traveling or wandering and wondering. We need a guide. We need to look to God and then follow Him with what He provides. God was their guide and used the star as a navigational tool for them, just like God was the guide of the Israelites in navigating them away from Pharaoh and bondage and slavery. God was leading the wise men to something good. Remember last week when we spoke of the Exodus, we said that when we make a move, it is important to not be distracted by what is behind us, but instead to focus on where we are going and on what is in front of us. And while we are in exile, this journey can then be a time of learning and growth, even though it may be a time of testing that is quite painful at times. A friend of mine had gone through a very difficult time. It had stretched over a period of several years. There was great loss in the midst of the journey this person was in. Going through this journey, God revealed Himself to my friend by putting all of the right people and resources around so that a change of heart and mind could begin to take place. In the middle of that time of exile, and it truly was exile, my friend came to a realization of God's existence and began asking questions, searching for God, attending church. And over a series of months, God began to change my friend's heart and mind. This scripture was happening, being transformed by the renewing of the mind. And in the midst of it, my friend never blamed God or became angry at God during this time of exile. And it was a very painful time for this person. Instead, in the midst of all the loss, it was said by my friend that the whole experience was used for a supernatural meeting of God in the midst of struggle and trial. Many years later, my friend is walking steadily with God and has slowly seen great restoration and healing in life. My friend is genuinely smiling again and living in a better place in life. Times of waiting and exile can move us to places of growth, learning, and joy that are not found in the normal places of life. My friend was able to find God in the middle of a time of exile. That focus on God led to the best conclusion, a connection with the Almighty God in a personal way. The light of the star guided the Magi to Jesus, the light of the world. The star was their guide, not their God. You see, God will place people and things in our lives to lead us to Himself. We must appreciate the mechanisms that God uses to reveal Himself to us. We have to be careful to hold on to those things lightly. When we have teachers, leaders, mentors that we trust, that is a good thing. But we must also recognize that those mentors, teachers, and leaders will not be around forever. But the Lord will. One more thing about that star. Matthew writes that it stopped. That means that this star was moving. It was leading them, and when they were where they needed to be, the star stopped. Stars do not do that. This speaks to the precision of God's plan and His supernatural intervention. We need to remember this for our own lives when we think things are out of order. What's happening? God's order will often look way different than ours. We need to wait and watch and see what God does. The Magi saw the star stop over the place where the child was. One more thought from our biblical scholar. He says this: "And they set out for Bethlehem on the final evening of their long trip. The long-tailed comet, then in the southern sky, would have appeared to be going ahead of them as the comet set. Its tail would have been oriented upwards, turning it into a giant pointer that, from the Magi's perspective, highlighted one particular location within Bethlehem." Amazing. Only God could do something like that. To make a star stop and point makes me think of the psalm that says, "The heavens declare the glory of the Lord." The verse goes on to say that the three kings were overjoyed when they saw this. I like that word, overjoyed. It's like joy on steroids. So much joy that you cannot contain it or explain it. Here's a picture of my grandson, Moses. He loves diggers. Whenever he sees a digger, he's overjoyed. He can't contain himself. He gets so excited. This is how I imagine these three men to be, unable to contain their joy. Think about the series of events that led to their joy overflowing. The Magi followed the star for a long time. We do not know the struggles, frustrations, elations, discouragements that they encountered along the way, but we do know this: God moved them. For some reason, they were drawn to seek something or someone greater than themselves. God led them. With a star in the sky, they were captivated and captured while in exile from their homes. God sustained them. For many months, they traveled and did not turn around. And then they arrived. They arrived at their destination and were filled to overflowing with joy. Like Pastor Brian said, exile will always end. But then something else happened. Verse 11 says, "On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him." This is a beautiful moment. Uncontainable joy that turned into worship when they were in the presence of God. This was the culmination of their journey. This is what they had traveled for. Christmas reminds us that in the middle of our journey, whatever that may look like, that there can be joy. And this joy is found in the miracle of a gift, and that gift is Jesus. And he is there for all of us. All we have to do is to be like the Magi. We just need to look for him. Don't forget to look for him while you journey through your week. Because just as God guided the Magi, he can do the same for each of us. In the midst of the exile of our wandering, and waiting, we must watch. Because he will always uniquely and probably even creatively lead us to the best place, the place of joy, the place where Jesus is found.